Good morning. This week and next week we'll wrap up the study about the character of Jesus and how it gives us insight into how the Gospels were written and the truth of the Gospels. One of the chapters we're looking at, one of the two chapters looking at this week is entitled, How Do You Invent the Story of a God-Man, someone who's God and man? In the early centuries of the church, there were people who came up with ideas that were declared to be heresies, and there were church councils that were called to straighten things out, to discuss things. And one of them was the Council of Chalcedon, 451 AD, that came together primarily to discuss the nature of Christ. And they agreed that Christ had two natures at the same time, that he was fully divine and he was fully human. In modern times, we've often summarized the whole council as Jesus was 100% divine and 100% human. And that's not the same as being 50% divine and 50% human, because that would mean the humanity is diminished in some way. It's not the same humanity that we have. And that would mean his divinity is diminished, and it's not the same as really being God, And so that's why it's said he is 100% man and 100% God. And the reason that's important is because, for example, Jesus was taken into the wilderness to be tempted. He was hungry and thirsty. And in the book of Hebrews, we're told we can have comfort that we have a mediator between us and God. We have a new high priest seated in heaven, advocating on our behalf, who, unlike the old high priest, fully understands us while also being fully God. Now, if his divinity could simply overwhelm his humanity so that he doesn't really feel hungry and thirsty, then he wasn't really tempted out there. And then what it says in Hebrews isn't really true, that he can sympathize with us because he's been through it himself. Likewise, if his divinity could overwhelm his humanity, then you could say he doesn't really feel pain on the cross the way you would if you were being crucified. So then what is it exactly? So you need to have him be 100% human and 100% God in order for the character of Jesus that we find to make sense. Now, as we've seen in past weeks, what do skeptics say about the Gospels? They say that the divinity of Jesus was invented sometime in the first century, primarily because it's spoken of so directly in the Gospel of John, primarily by John or whatever group of Christians John represents, and so on and so forth. And we've discussed that actually you can see the divinity of Jesus very clearly in Matthew, Mark, and Luke as well. So the important point here, though, is that if someone invented the divinity of Jesus later, what you would expect to find would be old stories where Jesus seems to be human, and then somewhere else in the gospel somebody's put some new stories in where he seems to be divine. That's not what we find, though. What we find is in the same story, sometime in the same sentence, the same verse, you see a divine Jesus and a human Jesus at the same time. And you see that through the epistles and the early confessions of the church and so on. So, for example, there's a very famous passage in Philippians chapter 2 that we've read many times. We usually focus on the humility aspect in this because Jesus, as God, humbled himself. Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 5, says, "Make your own attitude that of Christ Jesus, who, existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used for his own advantage. Instead, he emptied himself by assuming the form of a slave, taking on the likeness of men. And when he had come as a man in his external form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even to death on a cross. For this reason God also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Now verses 6 through 11 are often set off in our Bibles. It seems like Paul is quoting an early short creed statement that Christians were already saying among themselves. And Paul was writing in maybe the 60s AD, the mid-60s, early 60s AD here, and citing something that Christians were already confessing their faith in. And we see that Jesus was fully human, that he humbled himself, but that he retained his divinity when he did so. He didn't give it up. He was both at once. Now in John chapter 11, we have a great example of the divinity of Jesus, but when we look back through it, we'll see his humanity. John 11, of course, is a famous chapter, the raising from the dead of Lazarus. And in verses 4 through 6, for example, it says, when Jesus had heard that Lazarus was sick, he said, "This sickness will not end in death, but it is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God, may be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. So Jesus is showing his divinity. He's a long way off, and he deliberately stays 2 more days so that Lazarus will definitely die before he gets there. And he says, but this is all for the glory of the Son of God. So he knows the future, and he knows he has the power of resurrection. So this is a statement of Jesus as divine. And we skip down to verse 11 of chapter 11. He said this, and then he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm on my way to wake him up." And of course the disciples didn't understand that. And in verse 14, Jesus clarified it. So Jesus then told them plainly, "Lazarus has died. I'm glad for you that I wasn't there so that you may believe, but let's go to him." So once again, Jesus knows events from far off. Jesus is divine. And then skip down to verse 23, when Martha has met Jesus on the road outside of their home. "Your brother will rise again," Jesus told her. Now, of course, what would Martha make out of that? She believed in a someday resurrection in the future for the afterlife, for everybody. And so she had to assume that he was talking about that, not something specific right now. And so Martha said, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, even if he dies, will live. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die ever. Do you believe this?" Yes, Lord, she told him, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. So he's telling her something that she won't fully understand until a little bit later in this story. And then, of course, the tremendous climactic divinity proof that Jesus gives is the resurrection. We look down in verse 39. Remove the stone, Jesus said. Martha, the dead man's sister, told him, Lord, he already stinks. It's been 4 days. Jesus said to her, didn't I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they removed the stone, and then Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you heard me. I know that you always hear me, but because of the crowd standing here, I said this, so they may believe you sent me. After he said this, he shouted with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out bound hand and foot with linen strips and with his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, loose him and let him go. So we have all of these proofs of Jesus' divinity, and skeptics would say, well, that's John. John is emphasizing the divinity of Christ, so he's probably making up stories about the divinity of Christ. But how easy would it be to make up a story where you have a very strongly divine Jesus, and interweaved in the story you have a very human Jesus at the same time? So we look back in this chapter with a different eye. Where are the passages in this same story where Jesus is very human? Start back in verse 3. So the sisters sent a message to him, Lord, the one you love is sick. When Jesus heard it, he said, this sickness will not end in death, but is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. And then in verse 5, there's a parenthetical remark. Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. That's a very human thing, to have a special love for certain special people. You can say, I love everybody in the world, but you don't love, if you're a human being, you're not God. You don't love everybody equally. You don't know everybody equally. You're not equally bonded and attached to every person in the world. That's not the way humanity works. Jesus in his humanity had some special people here, Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And that's in the same passage that we were quoting about his divinity earlier in verses 3 through 6. That's not just divine love. That's a human love. We skip down to verse 32. After he had met Martha, remember, Martha came in and got Mary. And Mary left the house where she was with the other mourners and came out. And in verse 32 it says, when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and told him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her crying, and the Jews who had come with her crying, he was angry in his spirit and deeply moved. Where have you put him? He asked. Lord, they said, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. Now, once again, this is a human kind of love. There's a lot of different translations in verse 33. My translation said he was angry in his spirit. There are translations that say he groaned in the spirit, he was troubled in the spirit, he was deeply moved in the spirit. The word that's used here isn't used too many times, and every other time it's used, it implies a certain kind of righteous indignation, kind of the righteous anger when you see something that's wrong. So it's not just what we see in verse 35, Jesus wept. It's also that a lot of interpreters today will say that Jesus was angry at this temporary triumph of Satan and death and the pain that it was causing Mary and Martha. And that was his righteous indignation. What have Satan and death done here to these people? That's, at one moment, that's a human reaction of sympathy, but it's also informed by being an omniscient God who understands everything and understands Satan and death and resurrection. Okay, but that's, once again, this is the Gospel of John. So what about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels? Well, we've already read in past weeks in Mark chapter 2, the famous story where Jesus forgave the sins of the paralyzed man who was lowered through the roof by his friends. And he forgave his sins so that the Jews would start murmuring among themselves, that's blasphemy. Who can forgive sins except God? And then he could prove that he was God by saying, okay, what's easier? To say your sins are forgiven, or to say, take up your bed and walk? But so that you will know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins, I say, rise, take up your bed and walk. And he did. And that's a great proof of his divinity. But in the same sequence of miracles, in the next chapter, Mark chapter 3, we see something interesting. We see this same human righteous indignation. Mark 3, starting in verse 1, now he entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a paralyzed hand. In order to accuse him, they were watching him closely to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. He told the man with the paralyzed hand, stand before us. Then he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. After looking around at them with anger and sorrow at the hardness of their hearts, he told the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Immediately the Pharisees went out and started plotting with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. So Jesus has compassion on the man. He has righteous indignation and sorrow, and he has the power to heal, all in one little tiny story here. So is this a humanity story, a divinity story? Well, it's both. And it's not added later by John. In Matthew chapter 23, we see Jesus weeping over Jerusalem. Starting in verse 37, the end of the chapter. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, yet you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will never see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now there's a lot of sympathy here. He has a special bond to the city of his own people, Jerusalem. He laments over this city more than he would any other, because once again, that's the way human love is. You have certain special attachments. He's a Jew, and this is Jerusalem. But at the same time, there's divine prophecy here. He's prophesying the Palm Sunday, the entrance into Jerusalem. You won't see me again until you cry out, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. But then he prophesies beyond that. Your house is left to you desolate. And in the next chapter, he begins his prophecies about the destruction of Jerusalem in response to a question from the apostles. So this is God speaking in prophecy right here, but this is a human being offering a human lament for his own people who are close to him that he loves and what's going to happen to them. So in the same story, someone said no one but God could pronounce over a whole city like this. No one but a man could lament for special people like Jesus did. But if we turn back in Matthew chapter 11, there's a famous passage, the "My yoke is easy" passage. Verses 28 and 29. The end of chapter 11 of Matthew says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. All of you, take up my yoke and learn from me, because I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for yourselves. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus' compassion for other people comes through in these words. But think about it. It's also his divinity, because what human being would talk about how he has a yoke to lay on everybody else? Even if you do say it's light. I can't say that to people. I can't lay some yoke on you or some burden on you. And so once again, in this brief passage, we have his humanity, but we have this little hint. Who can lay a yoke on you? And now look at the verse before that, verse 27. What's the context? All things have been entrusted to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son desires to reveal him. So the divinity claims and the human compassion are all mixed up together in 3 verses back and forth here. No one can compose that. It's not really credible. Jesus is a God that we have to worship and obey. He's also a man who loves us, and we have to love him. Could somebody really make up that kind of character? In the 19th century, there was a scholar, Charles Rowe, who was looking at this whole idea of studying characters in history like we're doing, and he observed that it's very, very difficult for any human author to come up with a character who's divine and yet who suffers. Because that just doesn't seem to go together, does it? To be divine and to suffer. In fact, I hope to get around to teaching about messianic prophecy so that we can have an idea of what the Jews were expecting. But just to give you a hint, if you look through the Old Testament, the messianic passages portray 4 different things. And the Jews had a hard time understanding how one person could be these 4 things. And so they started to theorize that maybe this was like 3 or 4 different people. You've got the Messiah as the new king for the nation. You've also got Messiah as the new high priest. Well, now that's odd, because the king and the priest can't be the same person in Mosaic law. And so this would have to be something new. You've also got the Messiah as a new prophet, spoken of as being greater than Moses as a prophet. Kings and prophets, they reasoned, weren't forbidden to be the same person, but they never were. So it's possible that a Messiah could be a new prophet greater than Moses and also be a new king. And that would be a new thing in the history of Israel. But a new high priest, maybe that's a second person who comes along with the Messiah to help the Messiah, because they had a hard time conceiving of that. But what's the fourth kind of messianic prophecy? The suffering servant, like we see in Isaiah, like we see in Psalm 22. Now that's really hard to picture if you're a Jew before the time of Jesus. How can the new king, who's a new prophet, also be the suffering servant? And so many of them reasoned, maybe that's yet another person. Maybe that's a third person, another helper for the Messiah. That's the only way they could really make sense out of it. Because how can you even conceive that this great, powerful character suffers? To the human mind, that doesn't really seem to make sense. God doesn't suffer. And so his anointed Messiah, how could he suffer? And so this is why it was really hard for people to understand Jesus to some extent when he spoke of his own suffering and prophesied it. No ancient character fit that. Before the time of Jesus, there was no real or fictional character who ever combined divinity and power with being a lowly suffering person, because that just doesn't really seem to fit. How can you create a character, if you're an early Christian, who is God and man at the same time, and yet he subjects himself to these petty little Roman local authorities and allows them to execute him? That's just not something that's readily conceivable. If you had lived at that time and had never heard any of this before. And that's something we're going to return to next week, which is, do you see how easy it is for us to kind of take all this for granted, because this isn't new to us. We've heard this a good bit of our lives. And it's not revolutionary to us if you grow up in America and you grew up near a church and so on. But if you were in the first century, nothing like this has ever been talked about in history. There's never been a character like this. And certain things don't seem to go together, being fully divine and fully human. What happened when Jesus proclaimed his divinity? What was the reaction he got from Jews when he did things like forgive people of their sins? When he said, before Abraham was, I am. What was the reaction? You're blaspheming. Let's take up some stones and go after this guy. But that also brings up another point. If you're one of the first century Jewish followers of Christ, like the apostles, how likely is it that you would invent such a character or embellish such a character when your whole life you've been indoctrinated in the teachings of Judaism, which says that can't be, that's blasphemy? You're not going to invent a character like that because it goes against so much of what you've been indoctrinated into all your life. So where can this character come from except from heaven, except he really is this way and he really revealed himself to be a revolutionary new character in history? Nobody can make this up, especially a first century Jew with what they had been trained to believe. The natural reaction was he's blaspheming if he claims to be divine. So we will stop there and finish up next week. and I appreciate your attention. We'll contemplate next week, to what extent have we kind of taken some of the character of Jesus for granted, and what can we gain by thinking about these things? So, thank you for your time. Food upstairs in the kitchen, don't forget.